Hello, Emily St. John Mandel. Hello, and a very warm welcome to you. Thank you very much for being present here with us today to talk about your latest novel published by Rivage and entitled The Glass Hotel, translated by Gérard de Chergé. This discussion is organised by the Quais du Polar Festival in partnership with the Canadian cultural sector. In July 2021, the Quais du Polar Festival will be organised, and I'd like to say thank you very much for both of these entities for giving us the opportunity to talk about your latest novel. I really am delighted to have you here with us today, and I remember I had the opportunity to meet you in the past a few years ago during the course of the Quais du Polar in Lyon, when your fabulous novel, The Lola Quartet, was published in 2015. And I'm delighted to have you here with us once again today. You are Canadian, you live in Brooklyn. You have published 5 novels in total. They've all been published in France by Rivage. We have Last Night in Montreal, The Singer's Gun, The Lola Quartet, Station 11, and last but not least, your latest book, The Glass Hotel. So all have been published by the same publishing house. Before we enter into the discussion about The Glass Hotel, I'd like to talk briefly about Station 11, published in 2016 in France. It was a dystopic book that we sometimes call a post-apocalyptic book that imagined a pandemic that spread across the world, and we follow a moving theatre group 30 years after the pandemic in a world, of course, that is totally devastated. We have lots of toing and froing between the flu period and the post-apocalyptic period. It's a novel that was extremely successful throughout the world, translated into over 30 languages, and unfortunately today it's particularly a book that resonates. Having said that, of course, we see the world crumble away, globally speaking, but there's a lot of resonance with what's going on at the current time, this COVID-19 pandemic. And so the first question I've got before we talk about The Glass Hotel is, what impression does it give you personally, Emily St. John Mandel, to see this situation arrive after having written Station 11?
To tell you the truth, it gave me absolutely no special preparation whatsoever when the pandemic arrived. I think I was as shocked and blindsided as everyone. Let me begin, though, by saying what a pleasure it is to be here. Thank you so much for interviewing me today. I wish so much we could do this in person, but I'm delighted that we can at least do this. And I would say a major difference between Station 11 and our current real life pandemic, aside from, thank God, the difference in mortality rates, is our technology. That it has actually been extraordinary in the past year that I've been able to have so many conversations with so many people who aren't here in my office. You know, it's we all get a little tired of Zoom, but it is a wonderful thing. You know, the truth of the matter is that there was always going to be another pandemic. That was something that became very clear to me in my research for that book, is that epidemiologists talk about pandemics in the same way that seismologists talk about earthquakes. And what I mean by that is no one ever talks in terms of, I wonder if there will ever again be another earthquake. There will always be another earthquake, and there will always be another pandemic. So I really feel that I predicted nothing, but at the same time, it was kind of strange to experience the real life experience, having spent so much time imagining what a pandemic would be like in my research and writing that book.
And of course, if I refer back to what you've said, yes, I'm absolutely delighted, as you are, even virtually speaking, that we have the opportunity to talk via Zoom. It's wonderful to be able to organise literary meetings and talk to authors, male and female, who unfortunately at the moment are not able to come and join us, and we're not able to come and join you either. Thank you for this answer, Emily St. John Mandel. And now I'd like to talk about The Glass Hotel. So this is your new book. I'm going to summarize it very briefly, even if, of course, it's rather difficult to summarize this novel. Let's just say that, like all of your previous novels, it presents a whole range of characters, numerous characters, and they're presented via a certain number of journeys going backwards and forwards between the past and the present. We meet right at the beginning of the book. It's not the first scene, but quite early on, we meet Paul, who is a musician who has many drug issues, and we meet his sister, Vincent. And at the beginning of the text, Paul is a maintenance or cleaning agent in a Caiette hotel, a luxury hotel structure, and she's a barmaid. And for reasons that aren't really explained, he etches onto the glass of the window in the hotel is a kind of tag. He etches the words, and if you were to swallow broken glass, and this is a massively violent text, the brother and sister's destiny is a destiny that is quite broken up, and it's going to break up even more, because on one hand she's going to become the trophy wife of a multimillionaire who owns the hotel. He's called Jonathan Alkaitis, very similar to Bernard Madoff, and Paul is going to go off in a totally different direction. Now, I'm not going to say where their destinies are going to take them, but their destinies will take them on even more surprising paths. And the first question I'd like to put to you about this book is, what was the triggering element that made you want to write this magnificent novel? Because it's very complex and very, very striking. It is very, very gripping. Was it the Madoff character who inspired the idea behind the book, or was it the sentence that you suddenly dreamt of? And if you were to swallow broken glass, was it the hotel itself, or was it something very different?
Thank you for your kind words about the book. It was a number of things. Something that I like to emphasize is that every character in this book is completely fictional. But that being said, the central crime is, of course, the same crime that Madoff committed. My fascination with that case, it came about partly because of the sheer scale of the crime. A 65 billion with a B dollar US Ponzi scheme. It was unbelievable. But more than that, I was fascinated by his staff. At the time the story broke, I had a wonderful day job for a writer. I was a part-time administrative assistant in a cancer research lab at the Rockefeller University in New York. I really adored my colleagues. They were very intelligent, friendly people. And when Madoff was arrested, and then 6 or 7 of his employees were arrested too, I found myself thinking, what was that office like? You know, you think of the camaraderie that you have with any group of colleagues going to work every day, that sense of shared mission. Now, imagine how much crazier that is, how much more intense if you're going to work every morning to perpetuate a massive crime. I mean, it's just the most deranged office environment imaginable. So the first chapter of the book that I ever wrote, after years of revision, ended up being chapter 10, and that's the office chorus. So those staffers who speak in a plural voice, like a kind of Greek chorus. So that was the starting point. At the same time, I've always loved ghost stories, and I don't write my novels from an outline. I just kind of wing it and see what happens. So what that means is that sometimes my books can take very unexpected directions. So I started off thinking that I was going to write probably a relatively brief novel, very tightly focused around this massive crime, a white collar crime story, essentially. But then the ghosts just took over as a theme. So it became more and more ghostly. That became more and more interesting to me. At the same time, there was really no model for the Madoff character, because Madoff was the most fundamentally uninteresting person imaginable. You know, right up until the very end, his interviews, you read them and he's just such a garden variety sociopath. Like there's nothing interesting happening there. So I knew I had to invent a completely different villain with a completely different family. I found it kind of interesting to think of it as being a book about money in one way or another, about social class. And I suppose, I think something that just fascinates me generally as a sort of weird little corner of the economy is the phenomenon of trophy wives. I liked the idea of a wildly intelligent trophy wife, because that's a character you just don't see very often. So that gave me Vincent. And then a lot of it came about from just imagining what kind of a person with what kind of a background would allow herself to be swept up so easily by this man offering a life of wealth. You know, she would have to be a little bit directionless, probably, without a clear idea of what her career is. I regret to say the writing on the wall of the hotel was inspired by something somebody said to me on Twitter, which is why I spend very little time on social media. You know, it was years ago, but that's what Twitter is. So, it was a matter of these elements of, menace and money and crime and ghosts and then container shipping, because there was a character from Station 11 who I wanted to use again, who's in that world, of all these elements coming together over a period of years to come up with a novel, which, to be frank, I can't describe succinctly either. It's very difficult. I've been looking for the elevator pitch for 3 years and I can't find it.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you very much for this answer. I'm so sorry that somebody wrote this terrible sentence to you on Twitter. It must be horrific to see that. Now, for those of you who are watching us and who haven't yet had the opportunity to read The Glass Hotel, and maybe who don't have enough knowledge about the economy, let me remind you basically what we mean by a massive Ponzi scheme that is at the center here. It's a financial con that means that you reimburse clients' investments, the first clients, using the money that comes in from the new clients until the system basically crumbles. And this can go on for a long, long time. So it's a system that is totally based on nothing, on a hot air. And so somebody says that Jonathan's strength is that he wants to give people the impression that they belong to a secret club. And we get the impression that Jonathan Alkaitis is quite charismatic. And in the whole setup that you described, there's a certain amount of affection, a certain amount of friendship among people who work for Jonathan Alkaitis. There's friendship between him and the investors. There's even a certain amount of affection, he says himself, between the people and their own money. There are links of affection, as we might say. Did you want to show through this book that even in the most organized of lies, the most elaborate of lies, there's always a part of truth and sincerity that remains and that continues to exist?
Yes, I think that's fair to say. I like the idea that more than one thing can be true at the same time. So, to go back to Vincent for a moment, of course, her arrangement with Jonathan is extremely mercenary. It's very financially based. But that doesn't mean they're not friends. They have real affection for each other and enjoy one another's company. And in a very twisted way, he really is friends with his investors, even though he's also stealing their life savings. It's immensely twisted. But yeah, I liked that idea. And it also speaks to the difficulty of writing a villain, which is that if you make them 100% cold and evil and heartless in every single aspect of their lives, that's Disney. That's boring. It's you end up with this sort of two-dimensional character who's just not that interesting to read about, in the same way that Madoff himself was not interesting to read about. So Jonathan was a very difficult character to write because he did have to have some kind of human warmth just to make him interesting.
And what actually makes him very interesting, and what means that we get attached to him, is that he hides in a parallel world, whereby, in fact, he lives the life he could have lived if he'd met other characters, maybe ghosts. And you show a great deal of interest, but not only in all of your literature, you show a great deal of interest in the question of, and what if I'd made a given decision rather than the other decision I made? And if I'd met such and such a person who I in fact haven't met? And it could even be at the level of the state. If the state had voted in favor of such and such a law, or if the authorities hadn't given power to a given character, what would have happened? And we sense that you're obsessed by the fact that there are many different lives that are possible out there for each of us as individuals. And at the end of the day, we only get to live one. Do you know where this obsession comes from? And the fact that you write, do you think that it's a way of consoling this thing within you, the fact that we're all condemned to living only one life?
I love that question. Yes, I do know where it comes from. So I hold dual citizenship. I was born in Canada, but my father was an immigrant from California. So I have passports for both Canada and the United States. But I spent all of my life in Canada until I was 22. I trained as a dancer. I went to the School of Toronto Dance Theatre for contemporary dance. I have no formal training whatsoever as a writer or in literature. So I do often have the idea that there's a counter life, as I put it in the novel, a counterfactual life, where I'm a dancer in Canada And that might be more plausible somehow than the life that I'm actually living. Nothing in my background or experience would have predicted that I'd be a novelist living in New York City. So I think it is partly that. And you're right. I am obsessed by the counterfactuals, the versions of reality that didn't happen. Both, and to your point, both personally and politically. In the United States, it's so easy to imagine a version of events where Trump was not elected president, because given the undemocratic nature of our system, his opponent won more votes than he did. It really wouldn't have taken much to shift that balance. How different would the last year have been here? If it had been a different president, if it had been someone who had taken the pandemic seriously. So those are the deathly serious state level counterfactuals. But then, of course, there are all the lives that we didn't lead. And as I was writing The Glass Hotel, I found myself thinking about that idea as a different kind of ghost story. I've always loved ghost stories, but I think that when we use that phrase, when we say ghost story, we tend to be talking in these narrowly classical terms, thinking about the specter wafting down the corridor in the Victorian mansion, that kind of thing. But I like the idea that our lives are haunted by the lives we didn't lead, the life where you went to a different school or emigrated instead of staying, or vice versa, or whatever the thing was. So yeah, that is an idea that interests me. It is also fundamental to writing fiction. As I mentioned earlier, I don't write from an outline. So I'll just start writing a novel and see what happens. And as you might guess, that makes for a spectacularly disorganized first draft, which I then have to revise and figure out. When I get to the end of a novel, I always have this feeling that I could have gone in 12 different directions from that starting point and written 12 completely different books. And it's just kind of a fascinating aspect of the form. So yeah, there are a lot of factors there. And you're right, I am obsessed.
And it's very, very interesting the way in which you managed to very clearly explain all of the power, the fictional power, and the power of your imagination that is very, very strong. And yet at the same time, in all of your novels, there is a political background. There's always a political background. The question of the financial crisis, the question of the management of the pandemic, crisis management, generally speaking. You talk also, for example, about the madness of the world's economy. And this is all part of something that is highly imaginative. Are you aware, nevertheless, that you're writing political novels, or not at all? Or is it something that basically comes out without you consciously doing so?
Usually it comes out without me consciously doing so. I have had the occasional project, like most notably my second novel, The Singer's Gone, On ne joue pas avec l'amour in France, which was that was more explicitly political because it had to do with the incredible difficulty of immigrating legally to the United States. So, sometimes I'll write a book where it does have this explicitly political backdrop, but more often I don't see them as being political novels, strictly speaking, just as being novels set in the world. There's this wonderful phrase, which I wish I could remember the exact wording, a quote from Hannah Arendt. And it was something to the effect of, sometimes people tell me that they're not political. And my response is, oh, you don't care about the world or the future or what happens to you or what happens to your loved ones. So I think that if you're engaged on some level with the world, it's impossible not to be political on some level.
What's very interesting with Hotel Caiette itself, because that's the title of the Glass Hotel, it's a place that is absolutely fascinating. As I said, it's in the backwaters, it's off the coast of Vancouver, but at the same time, the main character who looks after it says, that most people are ready to pay an absolute fortune to escape temporarily from the modern world. That's a quotation from the book. And in fact, we realize that there's a real paradox between the ultra rich people and poorer people. In other words, you talk about the ultra rich people. On the one hand, they contribute to this world, the world that they gradually shape in the way that suits them. But at the other end of the scale, they're ready to pay a fortune to escape from this world. And here there's a real paradox. So I think there's a political message, in other words, about human nature that is full of contradictions.
I think you're right. You know, it's a strange problem, if you can call it that, of wealthy people in the modern world, where, you know, I can't speak to the situation in France because I haven't spent much time there. But in New York City, there is such an intense culture of work. And you really never encounter people who are wealthy and part of a leisure class. There's just not much leisure. The people who I'd expect to encounter in New York who are quite wealthy, they work 100 hours a week. It's insane. It's just this intensely dedicated life of work and money, and it's horribly intense. And the weird paradox is that people with a lot of money, you know, they'll pay a fortune for the fastest internet and the newest phone and all of the gadgets that keep them hyper connected to the world. And the paradox is they would do anything to turn that off. You know, you kind of see it on a micro level with the software that we use. There's an app called Freedom, which I've used for years, which turns off the internet when you need to focus on the novel that you're writing. So it's kind of fascinating to me that on the one hand, connectivity is so important for all of our jobs. You know what? I shouldn't say that. Connectivity is important for a lot of jobs in the modern world, but we sort of secretly long for its absence. And we do really want to turn off the internet sometimes. And perhaps if I had that kind of money and time, I would want to go to a hotel where, you know, I couldn't really talk to the modern world and just rest for a couple of weeks.
Now, when we talk about this hotel, let's carry on about the hotel. I'd like to talk about Walter. Initially speaking, Walter is the night watchman or the night manager of the hotel. He looks after it very carefully. We see that he's very attached to the hotel, and without giving too much away, because obviously we don't want to deprive the readers of reading about what goes on in the story, he's going to end up finding himself in a situation when the owner of the hotel is going to be poisoned. He's going to find himself as the watchdog, the guardian of the hotel. And I'm under the impression when I read the book that he, at the end of the day, is maybe one of the only people who manages to lead their lives as they wish. And yet this life is to live alone, locked him in this distant place, cut off from the world. Are you under the impression that you gave him a happy destiny to Walter? And what's he incarnating in terms of your vision of the world and your vision of human destiny?
He just speaks to the idea that different people are better suited to different lives. That, you know, perhaps on a personal level, I grew up in a very rural place. It was a small island off the coast of British Columbia, and it's a beautiful place. It's beautiful. It's all forest. You couldn't see your neighbors because just woods all around you, and the ocean is there. There aren't many places I've been to in the world that are more beautiful, but I was desperate to escape. I was just like, I just want a big city. So from the time I was 15 years old, I was plotting to get to the biggest city I could possibly find. And my point is just we're suited to different environments. You know, I understand why people want to live in these beautiful remote places. I'm personally happiest in big cities. I liked the idea that what Walter discovers about himself is that he finds true joy in solitude. And, you know, we tend to think of human connection as being absolutely necessary for happiness. And I think it is to some degree, but we require different degrees of it. You know, Walter lives a life where he sees a handful of people from one week to the next. He talks to his sister on the phone, and that's enough. He kind of likes being alone. So, yeah, he was an interesting character in that way because he'd lived his whole life in customer service and then found true happiness not dealing with people anymore.
Let's talk briefly about the theatre, because I think this is a very important subject in your book. But before we do, I'd like to talk about roles. We've talked about Walter and the role that plays. And maybe we could say that one of the reasons why he's so happy is that he, at the end of the day, is one of the characters who doesn't have to play a role anymore. He plays the role of himself, his real life. He shows his true personality. And in this book, we talk a great deal about Jonathan. After Jonathan has fallen, Vincent finds herself in a bar, and she meets Mirella, who is one of her friends from the time when she was rich. And Mirella was very, very rich, but she came from a poor background like Vincent. And Mirella had managed to lead her life. And when she meets Vincent, she pretends she doesn't recognize her. And Vincent is shocked because she says, well, this is just not possible. But then she thinks, but we were just actresses. And so the reason why we were able to succeed in this environment was simply because we were able to hide our own true origins. And here you show something drastic, dreadful about human life. It's the fact that all we do in our lives is play roles, and that human nature is all about a lot of theatre and playing roles that we choose for ourselves or that society gives us.
I think you can choose to see that as negative, but I'm not sure it has to be. I mean, I'm a different person talking to an interviewer at a literary festival than I am talking to my 5-year-old daughter, but I'm not playing a role. It's all me. And we're all like that. You're a little bit different speaking with your colleague than you are with your grandmother. I don't think there's anything false about it. But at the same time, there is absolutely that element of theater in this book. And I think it's fair to say that although we are naturally different people in different environments, there are situations in life where that gets carried to a really awful extreme where, most obviously Jonathan, who's playing the role of a legitimate investment advisor and in so doing ruining lives. Vincent is a little bit more ambiguous to me because she's a bartender when she meets Jonathan. And, if you haven't been a bartender, you just have to watch one to see what a performance that is. It's and that's all of customer service, I suppose. You're kind of playing a role behind the bar. And it doesn't feel like much of a stretch to her to just kind of expand the role very slightly. So I think it's fair to say that role playing can be awful, but I don't think it always is.
It's very interesting what you said in terms of theatre, because at the end of the day, theatre is also one of the main themes that underpins all of your novels. We're under the impression that we jump from one scene to the next, from one backdrop to the next, and we go behind the curtains in the theatre, and it makes for some very, very original, unusual writing. At a given moment in time, for example, you talked about the staff's hearts, the central staff who talk about how they were deceived by Jonathan. Shakespeare could be referred to, and there's a famous quotation from Shakespeare, "The world is a theatre," and as you say, everybody plays a role, and you're absolutely right. And it's not necessarily a negative factor. I'd like to know what is the role played by theatre in your literature? How does it rhythm your life? How does it rhythm your pen, the pen that you write with? And you personally, could you imagine writing theatre?
A year ago, I would have said no, that I couldn't imagine writing theater, but I've been writing for television for the past year. I'm working on an adaptation of The Glass Hotel, and it's been so rewarding. It's a completely different form that I'd had no experience in. I love writing novels, but at this point, I've actually written 6. So it's a pleasure to try something new. So I suppose now I could imagine writing theater. It has an immediacy to it that I like. And in the way that it ties into my work, I think it depends a little bit on the novel, where in Station 11, it was so explicit that it was about this theater company. And that was part of the project of the book, was writing about the lives of actors in this traveling group. But there is also a way in which one could see the novel as a stage and the characters in the novel as characters on that stage. So there's something inherent to the form that, just logistically and technically writing a novel, you are moving characters around and moving them through time and having them say things. And it makes me feel like there is an inherently theatrical element to writing fiction.
Now, let's say the other major art that resonates with your approach is music as well. For example, in the Lola Quartet, even the French title refers to music. Originally speaking, one could have talked about jazz. In the Glass Hotel, we could talk about the Goldberg variations. Vincent's brother listens to concertos, and there's the sister, and there's the fact that music can lead back to certain characters. There are lots of echoes in your text between music and fiction. There are tunes, the tune that the singer sings at the beginning of the book in English, I Always Come to You. This represents the novel because the characters come back together and are even haunted by other characters who never leave them alone. I'd like to ask you, do you have an obsession or a great deal of taste for music? And how do you actually make music serve your work? And are you under the impression that you borrow techniques from certain composers in order to create literature, which is very interesting?
Well, thank you. I am under that impression, or perhaps it's less a matter of certain composers than just certain musical tropes, I guess you could say. So one of the great pleasures of being published in multiple languages is that sometimes you get the title that you really wanted for your French publication where you didn't get it in English. So the Lola Quartet, my third novel, that was with a previous publisher who they were lovely. And I really appreciate what they did for me in the United States and Canada. My editor and I had completely different taste in titles. So to be honest, the Lola Quartet was the one title that neither of us hated from our two lists. So that was the English title. The title I really wanted was the Sebastian Variations. So I got that in the French publication. And in that book, there's a repeated scene of high school students playing a song that you visit. I think it's been a number of years, but I want to say you see it 3 times from different perspectives of different characters. And that spoke to me of this idea of theme and variation, that it's a different scene depending on whose perspective you see it from. So I like the idea that fiction can echo music in that way in terms of theme and variation, which dovetails with another interest of mine, which is memory. It's really interesting to me to think about the way that 3 people can see the same scene and come away with 3 completely different descriptions of what happened, and none of them are line. It's just the strangeness and unreliability of memory that creates its own kind of variations. Beyond that, music has always been really important to me. I played the piano for years. I like to listen to music while I work sometimes. It helps with concentration. I live across the street from a school, which is kind of nice. I like the sound of the kids playing, but sometimes you just need to focus. So I'll often put on noise blocking headphones and listen to classical music or ambient electronica while I'm writing fiction. And it helps me to focus. And I find myself thinking, maybe this is a little bit fanciful, but I think there's something to it, that sometimes I think the tone of the music can pervade the work that I'm writing.
Oh, that's extremely interesting. The relationship that you talk about between music and actually writing. Kandinsky, I think, said that when he painted, he could hear the music linked to the specific painting that he was placing on the canvas. And we're almost under the impression when we listen to you speaking, we get a sense. And when we read the book, we sense something very musical that is actually in the verbs. And I think this is a way of illustrating very unusual talent, great talent. I have a question, and this is as a reader being curious. At the moment, we talk a great deal about water, swimming pool waters, water and swimming pool that overflows with water. Vincent is very unsettled when she can't see the difference between the horizon of the swimming pool and the water. You talk about oceans, you talk about the sea, you talk about the water in which the heron's mother drowns. Water is always an all-pervading theme. In what way was it important for you, and what does water symbolize for you? Was it subconscious, or was it something very, very deliberate that you wanted to say about water?
A little bit of
this
both.
massive subject.
Oh, a little bit of both. Um, it's funny. I think that when you start writing books, your personal interests and obsessions and pleasures inevitably adhere themselves to the work. And then the more books you publish, the more obvious that is to the world. Everybody sees these themes. There's the theater, there's the music, there's water, there's travel. The things that keep recurring that you might not even be consciously aware of as obsessions. Um, I don't know why I'm so fascinated by water. I've always found it really beautiful. It could partly be my upbringing. I'm from a very small island in the ocean, and it was just so much a part of our lives. It was the kind of place where you could go out in your canoe and catch salmon for dinner. So like you'd have a very practical relationship with the water. You'd take a ferry to Vancouver Island if you need to do grocery shopping. It's always been important to me to live in a place that was, if not the ocean, at least by a lot of water. When I left British Columbia, I moved to Toronto, which it's not an ocean, but that lake is so big, it might as well be. And then Montreal and the St. Lawrence River. And then finally, New York City, where a real pleasure of living here is that I can see New York Harbor from my terrace on top of my house. And I'm calmed by it. I've always just been so drawn to the ocean in particular.
It's very interesting because I said earlier that you talk a great deal about paradoxes, ambiguities, and characters. And there's another one that revolves around water, because water provides life. You say it makes you feel peaceful and calm, but it can also bring about death, the death of certain people. And there's this tension and this ambiguity that is very present in your work. And it reminds us that another point that is very important to you is this literary style, detective or crime fiction. Let me complete this interview by a question that a lot of French people are worried about. It's that of the genre. In other words, we could say that you write dark fiction, you write about dystopias for Station 11, fantasy novels because you've got ghosts, the ghosts that pervade the book. And I think you're attracted to science fiction. I read that in one or two interviews that I've read about. I'd like to know, what is your relationship in relation to crime fiction and the genre? Do you feel well and truly part of a specific genre, or do you think there is a massive scope that you can explore freely?
I think that too often we talk about genre in a very limited way. I feel like as a species, we have this mania for classification. Is it literary fiction or is it polar? Is it science fiction or is it something else? An idea that I really like, that I find, I suppose, more generous, almost like more expansive, is that a work can be more than one thing. So I love the idea that a work could be a crime novel and a ghost story and literary fiction. Or in the case of Station 11, that it could be science fiction and literary fiction. And, because you're right, like otherwise you can kind of drive yourself crazy figuring out where a book fits into all these little categories. My books can be and are categorized in these different genres, but they don't seem to me to be that dissimilar. There is essentially the same project in all of these books, which is I like writing about people and the way they relate to each other. I like there to be a strong plot, a narrative engine, which is how I so often move in the direction of crime fiction. I like a detective or an investigation or, something to give the book some velocity. But I also really do try to make the writing as beautiful as possible. I value clarity and lucidity and simplicity. So it does have the effect of putting me in all of these different genre categories at once. And perhaps a good example of of how silly that can get is my first three novels were published as literary fiction in North America, but polar in France. So in Canada and the United States, I would be doing these literary fiction oriented events. And then I would go to the polar festivals in France and sit next to the guy who wrote 3 Days of the Condor. Same book, but totally different categories. So yeah, I love the idea that a book can be more than one genre. And I think that actually we're living in a really wonderful time to be a writer and to be a reader, because that idea is much more accepted now than it was even 10 or 15 years ago.
Yes, it's absolutely wonderful because we can see, yes, that all these borders are very, very artificial and you can travel freely between one universe and another. One last point before we round off the interview, I'd just like to say that for those who are watching us, Vincent in the book is called Vincent because her parents gave her the name of a poetess, Edna St. Vincent Millay. Can you please tell us why did you want to make a clear reference to this specific poet?
Partly just that I loved her name. Edna St. Vincent Millay went by Vincent her entire life. And I thought that was an interesting name for a woman. But more importantly, you know, Edna St. Vincent Millay was hugely talented from a very young age. She grew up in poverty, and then she wrote a poem when she was 17 years old that catapulted her into a completely new life. And that idea of catapulting yourself from one life into another by sheer force of will, that's something that I very much admire on a personal level. And it also was an idea I was trying to convey with my fictional Vincent, even though, you know, the means she uses are terribly different. But that same idea that by sheer willpower, you get from one life into the next.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for this answer that illustrates also the richness of your book. And thank you so much for giving us a fascinating interpretation of the world through the Glass Hotel. I would like to recommend the book very strongly to everybody who hasn't yet read the book, but also all of your books. I've read all of them and I adored all of them. And let me stress again, I've thoroughly enjoyed talking with you, Emily St. John Mandel. Thank you so much. And I'd also like to say a very good thank you to the International Quais du Polar Festival. Thank you to the Canadian Cultural Centre. Thank you very much to Dawn Sheridan, who's been our interpreter for this discussion. And thank you to all of the people who've made this encounter possible through the technical and virtual resources that we have. And Emily St. John Mandel, I'd like to say to you, I hope we will be able to meet you in flesh and blood very soon, because hopefully we'll be able to travel very soon and have a presence-based meeting. But once again, it was an immense pleasure to be able to meet you and talk about the Glass Hotel.
Well, thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure. And I'd like to echo all of your thanks. It's been such a pleasure to speak today. And I'm so grateful to everybody who made it possible.